Welcome to week 4 of your small groups. This week we're dropping off in Luke chapter 15, the parable of the prodigal son. So let's dive in. So we're in another parable this week, and this one starts in verse 11. You notice there's a series of 3 parables. We'll talk a little bit about that, but what we're reading this week starts in verse 11. So if you haven't read the parable of the prodigal son yet, do that quickly and then return here and join us. So we said that when we were looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan, the understanding a parable is like getting a joke. And if you don't catch the references in it, it's hard to catch the punchline. So sometimes parables are a little more like analogies. And in this case, what we have is a little bit more of a story. So we're going to cover the key details that help us get what this is getting at. Although I think it's pretty self-apparent, there are a few details. So let's start with the title first. This parable is called the parable of the prodigal son. Prodigal is the opposite of frugal. It means lavish to the point of being wasteful. And more than a story about a prodigal son, this story is also about a prodigal father, someone who is giving away lavishly. And I'm stealing intentionally from a book by Timothy Keller called The Prodigal God. In fact, most of the content from this is coming from that. If you've not read that book, that is a wonderful book to get the meaning of the gospel and how this story points to all of it. Timothy Keller was called America's pastor. He died not too long ago from cancer. I highly recommend that book, The Prodigal God, and I'm pulling from that. So there's your copyright detail. So it's apparent right from the opening lines of the story that this is a story of not just a prodigal son, but a prodigal father. It says that there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance." So the father divided his assets between them. And what that meant is that a father would have had to sell his assets. That would have been his cattle, his sheep, perhaps land, estate. He would have been probably a wealthy landowner, and it seems that he sold it all. So first thing I want you to see is that this is about a sacrifice that the father gives up in order to give the son what he's requesting. So the father gives prodigally to a son who goes off to waste it in wild living. Next thing I want you to see is about this son. And that if you've read the context leading up to this story, you'll likely know the ending. Jesus has told parables about a lost sheep, a lost coin, and now a lost son. So perhaps the right title for the story is the parable of the lost son, not necessarily the prodigal son. The son for whom the father gives up everything to have back. I think that captures lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. There's another thing to note. When the father sees the lost son, he was filled with compassion. So let's talk about the key to how that's one of the keys to understanding this parable. That word compassion is found across the Gospel of Luke. It's what Jesus feels when he sees a widow's dead son in Luke 7, and then he raises that son from the dead. In the parable of Good Samaritan, which we covered a couple weeks ago, the Samaritan has compassion for a wounded traveler. And then that word appears again here. The word itself is, I think it's a splagizomai. It refers to your intestines. The word kind of sounds that way, splagizomai. It's to have compassion on something. It's stomach churning compassion. So I want you all to notice that detail. And then let's get into some of the cultural details in this parable that I think are easy for us to miss in our modern context. So the father is filled with stomach churning compassion. And then he runs to embrace his son. And men did not run back then. Children might have run, young men, perhaps women, but the paterfamilias, the person over the household, the man of the house, he did not run. He would not bare his legs, lift up his I don't know, they wouldn't call it a skirt, whatever that is that they wore, his robe. He would not lift up his robe to run like a boy. But that's exactly what Jesus says this father does. So that's kind of a shocking image. Let's look at some other cultural things. Look at how the father clothes the lost son when he comes back. He gives him new sandals. It's probably been a long journey, a lot of walking. That one's pretty self-evident. And then he says, give him their best robe. Okay. And then he says, give him a ring. Now that best robe would have been the father's own robe. The best robe in the house would have been the father's. So he clothes him in the father's own robe. That's a cool detail. And then that ring is interesting. This would have been a signet ring that you use to impress into wax. So if you were signing a document and then you needed to say that the Lord of this house has said that, like, I don't know, we're making a transaction of some sort, selling so many sheep or whatever, you would imprint that to show that this is not a forgery. This is from the desk of the person over this house. And a son would have had that. And so for the father to give this ring to the son not only says you're welcome back into the home, but you're giving the full privileges of being an active member of this family who can make decisions for the house. That's remarkable in itself. He gives him his best robe, the father's own robe, and the father's own permission to do work in the house. And now we enter Act 2 of the parable. You know, there's the first part where it's about the son who goes away, and then the scene changes, and there's another brother that we're focused on. You know, it would have been nice if it just ended with Act 1. It has a nice ending. But you have to ask, why did Jesus continue? Y'all will get into that a little bit. But let's look at the context. This is going back to the first verse of the chapter 15, verse 1. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling, saying, this fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. And then after that is when Jesus tells these three parables of lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. So I want you to notice these two sets in this story. You have tax collectors and sinners that Jesus is eating with, and then you have Pharisees and scribes. And Jesus tells a story about a younger brother and an older brother. A story with a first act and a second act. So that's something to notice in terms of the layout of the story. That's something for y'all to explore. Why is there an Act 2? And how does that change the meaning of this parable? Let me give some fodder for that conversation because I think that's a worthwhile one to have. Notice that where the younger brother returns and he tells his father that I'm no longer worthy to be a son, so take me as like one of your slaves. Let me live with them, work with them. I will work for my living. And the older brother, when his father comes out to him, notice this. He tells his father that he has been a slave the whole time. He says, I've been here and I've been slaving for you. And that's interesting. Jesus releases slaves. So how is Jesus for both brothers? That's something to explore. I'll have that in the questions for y'all too. All right, in short, this is a parable about a prodigal father who gives lavishly to get back a lost son. It's an invitation for anyone who has that story of the younger brother to come back home, because the only thing the Father will show towards you is grace. This parable is also about how when the older brother rejects the return of the younger, the older brother rejects Jesus. Because don't miss this, he rejects the son whom the Father says was dead and is alive again. And that invitation into grace is open for him too. All right, enjoy your discussion.